arrivals and departures instead of passengers. For arrivals and departures, you see the same general trend. You look at 2020, you see the big drop off. You look at 2021, you see lots of improvement. And now the gold is the current year, 2022, even more improvement over last year. We're roughly each last couple of months around 20% reduction in operations compared to pre-COVID. Overall, there's seasonality. That's why it says 26 on the far right. There's some seasonality in the numbers, but call it pre-COVID. On average, an annual average day, you have over 2,500 operations a day. Currently, we're about 1,871 operations a day. So roughly about 26% under. We'll continue to track this. We look at Midway, relatively similar, a little bit better at 16%, but still relatively similar type of numbers. Now we look at operations across the country. And so we've got a lot going on in this chart. So we're looking at all the airports around the countries ranked to the left, kind of sorted from left to right based on busiest percentage compared to pre-COVID. I'll kind of go over that stat in a minute. We also have the bars color coded based on the geographic region in the United States it's from. And then we even have some slashes on some cargo hubs. So I know it's a lot going on, so we'll kind of walk through it, right? So we look at the far left, and that far left number, it's about 110%. That means that airport had more operations today than they had pre-COVID. Some airports around the country are doing better when COVID entered than pre-COVID. Some of those airports most airports are typically kind of in the Southwest, more destinations. Albuquerque's been growing quite a bit. Albuquerque has more. Palm Beach has more. Places like Miami and Las Vegas are doing really well lately. Places like Teterboro is that one in there. It's kind of a unique one because it's a general aviation in the New York area, but it's actually come back and done very well. Nashville's doing well. It's the B&A. Memphis is a cargo hub. It's doing well. So you start seeing the New Orleans. You see places like that. Even Denver's done pretty well. Houston, Salt Lake City. These are kind of more destination airports. These are where cities, these are where people have flown to. Those airports have fared the best. One thing you do notice is red in Midwest. We don't have any over to the far left. You kind of have to get toward the middle right of the page before you enter any Midwest airports like Kansas City or St. Louis. We've highlighted O'Hare and Midway for you as well to see how they're doing. Again, operations, they were roughly 80%. You saw that like 20% reduction. So if you see roughly about 70 to 80%, that's where the O'Hare and Midway are at. But this gives you an outlook across the country. And sorry for so much going on. We tried to put a lot on the page. We think it's helpful. And again, these are operations just like the last two pages. Now we break down both passengers and cargo. On the left, you can see how passengers are doing in 2022. They're going up. You can see compared to the last couple of years, it's better than obviously 2020. 2021, we also had an increase. There's seasonality at O'Hare and Midway. This one's O'Hare, but you can see that seasonality going up. We're already above the curve last year. We expect that curve to go over the peak when you hit June and July. The goal is to kind of go over that peak from last year to increase in passengers. Cargo, same kind of thing. We did see a deep dip in April, but a lot of that's due to supply chain and things. So we're hoping that gets resolved. I don't know if it will or not, but we're hoping that gets resolved and stays above the curve from last year. If it does stay above from the curve from last year, you notice that's significantly above the 2020 curve. So cargo has seen a large increase. But again, we talked about that. You guys know that. And then we showed this chart before. We haven't changed it. This is kind of just our historical look at aviation. There have been system shocks throughout time in aviation. Again, we have a lot going on. We have the red, which are more fuel shocks. The blue dots are more other types of shocks. And then we even got highlighted in these little bars, more recessions. You can see the Great Recession was the last big bar. We obviously had a major dip due to COVID in the operations in 2021 to 2022, but that's starting to rebound. And that chart essentially didn't change from the last time we saw it. Any questions? One thing I didn't mention, we have rebranded. We have a new logo you'll see on some slides. We haven't changed all of our reports. This new logo that you see for Chicago and at the bottom left CDA, this is just a rebranding. In fact, other city departments have this very similar logo, so it's trying to get more in sync with other city departments. So I failed to mention that. We have a rebranding you'll start to see. It hasn't been incorporated in all the reports to you, but that'll slowly get incorporated. I don't know. My guess is it probably was fairly cheap. Since other city departments were already using it, it was probably easy.
You know, I've done rebranding, but they are mainly expensive. So have fun. Any questions for regarding COVID? I agree that dip in the cargo is interesting. Coal mines are here in Minnesota. Watch the industrial market pretty closely. You can hear the coal mine starting to show trucks, rail. All right, seeing no questions, we'll move on to new noise factor for a little bit of discussion today.
Good morning, everyone. Chairman asked us to talk about what we know about the next new noise contour. And so in your packet, you have an FAA letter to ONCC Chairman Joe Annunzio. And I want to review for you question 2 and the answer, because the answer about the new noise contour is embedded in this letter and it's important and we should review it together. All right. So this letter from a couple of months ago, question 2. Please provide an update on OMP build-out runway utilization. What is the expected annual daytime runway utilization percentages? The same question for nighttime runway utilization. Should we expect any significant changes to the EIS runway utilization? So let's go through this answer. So the FAA writes, full build-out of the OMP will not occur until the FAA achieves Cat 2-3 service for 9 right 27 left. While the projected date for achieving this level of service is not until July 2023, the FAA is working diligently to achieve this level of service by the end of 2022. So just as a quick recap, as you know, 9 right was extended. The extension opened on December 2nd, about 5 months ago. Although the pavement is done, the construction team is working on finishing those navigational aids in order to allow arrivals on 9 right 27 left. And so this sentence is saying they're definitely on track to finish it by July of 23 in a year, but everyone's going to try and finish it by the end of this calendar year in 2022. And we've talked about that at a previous meeting. Okay. The FAA is conducting an environmental assessment of the city's proposed terminal area plan and air traffic actions to retain operational efficiencies, which the FAA plans to finalize by the end of 2022. So again, you'll remember last spring, many of you were invited to provide comments on the scoping document. The FAA released the idea of this environmental assessment, and they sought comments last spring. A year's gone by, the FAA is preparing that document, and we do expect it to be done by the end of this calendar year. The next sentence says, updated noise contours and runway utilization will be provided in the draft environmental assessment for the terminal area plan and air traffic actions, which will be published for public and agency review by the summer of 2022. That's good news. That means within the next couple of months, you're going to see the draft environmental assessment. And as you know from prior environmental reviews, typically an environmental assessment is looking at somewhere around 15 different environmental categories, and noise is clearly one of those 15. So this summer, you're going to get a preview of what's in the, or you're going to see what's in the draft. And so the FAA concludes that document, being the draft EA, will discuss anticipated runway utilization post build-out. An FAA decision on the terminal area plan and air traffic actions environmental assessment will supersede the record of decision issued for the 2005 O'Hare Modernization Environmental Impact Statement. That sentence is the most important. So what they're doing is saying, we are not going to do an OMP build out +5 noise contour. That's been the plan since 2005. However, because we have this new major environmental review, as part of that review, the FAA is reviewing where are we with existing conditions, where are we with future conditions. And so the noise contour that comes out of this TAP environmental assessment is going to supersede anything that was contemplated based on OMP 17 years ago, right? We are not going to continue to look at OMP assumptions from 17 years ago because a lot has changed since then. We've had a recession, we've had a pandemic, right? So the draft EA, when you see that this summer, that's going to give you the current snapshot of what's going on with noise, okay? And when that document is done by the end of the year, right, we'll do the draft, there will be a public comment period on the draft EA, and by the end of the calendar year, the FAA will finish it and issue the final EA. That noise contour will be the new noise contour until such time as we do an environmental review for the Fly Quiet program. And then at that point, several years down the line, the Fly Quiet contour would likely supersede the TAP and air traffic actions noise contour. I hope that's clear. Are there any questions? Yes.
Great to sound. Thank you for walking through this. There's a lot of technical stuff that I think you don't understand that. So sentence by sentence, I think that. But it says that we're looking to achieve the Cat 2, Cat 3 service by the end of 2022. Right? But we're going to see draft noise contours by the summer of 2022 ahead of that. But how can we, what assumptions are being made? If we don't know how the runways will be fully used and burnt in, how are we making those assumptions?
Right, so that's a good question, and the FAA will lay out all of the assumptions in the appendices of the draft EA. What you're describing, Evan, is important in that, right, when these environmental reviews are done, everyone is estimating future conditions based on what is known at that time. So this draft EA, they'll be looking at some existing condition, and then they'll be utilizing what we know about the future, right? And as you know, the Fly Quiet 21 is not yet decided. So this FAA document, it's not going to talk about Fly Quiet in terms of what might be. It's only going to talk about what's going to happen if we continue existing Fly Quiet, right? Because that is what's known. That's a reasonable assumption. It is not reasonable for the FAA to make an assumption about future Fly Quiet when you haven't even voted on it yet, right? That would be way too aggressive of an assumption for the FAA. So they're not going to do that. They're only going to look at what would happen if we take the existing Fly Quiet, such as it is, and extrapolate that out for the period of review. Does that help?
Yeah, it's like so something
Correct. And I think that's the challenge, in that this EA will be a snapshot of what we know and what would happen but for future Fly Quiet, right? They have to use what's on the books, and what's on the books is existing Fly Quiet. Now, we all know, and the FAA knows because they've been to many, many of your public meetings over the last 6 or 7 years that we've been discussing it. We all know that you're getting close to decision-making on final Fly Quiet. But this document that they've been preparing, it's too aggressive to assume those changes until you take a vote and something is turned into the FAA. So they're trying to be reasonable with what assumptions are appropriate for existing conditions versus near-term future conditions.
Is that a customary assumption though for 9-27 left? Is it hasn't been burnt down? We know that, you know, how air traffic controllers decide to use runways is how air traffic, their decision, not a decision for CDA.
Correct. So remember that when the OMP EAS was approved in 2005, at that time, everyone thought the whole program would be done in 8 years, right? Build out was supposed to be 2013, and build out +5 was anticipated to be the year 2018. But, right, time went by, things got complicated, those milestones were not met. And so here we are, the FAA is clarifying that the build out condition, pavement's done, but we're not utilizing it in a build out manner. That's not going to be done until this runway achieves Cat 2-3, right? So those assumptions that were made in 2005 assumed a timeline which in fact has not come to fruition. And so this TAP EA is going to refresh the assumptions based on what we do know in the present, right? So remember that all of that, Evan, when the OMP EIS was approved in 2005 and we did the re-eval in 2015, everybody was refreshing the assumptions or making assumptions based on what they knew at the time in terms of what I would call high level of confidence, right? There are certain things where all of the modelers are like, that's too much of a stretch. We're not comfortable making that assumption, right? So your question about 9 right, everybody knows it was going to be done. The issue is at what point in time. And so at this point, this document will also assume 9 right is done. And what happens when we're in that build out condition and we're modeling conditions at that time.
And then we'll come back for the fly quiet. We'll use more data on how that runs.
Yes.
Inputs.
Yes.
That's customary.
Yeah, when you do a big analysis pursuant to NEPA, you are required to look at sometimes what we call the do nothing alternative, right? Versus what is the proposed action? What is it that you're trying to do? And you're comparing the proposed action to the no action. And in doing so, you're looking at the existing conditions at that time and the future, right? And so it sort of is like, what is the proposed action and when do you propose it would occur, right? Is it something that will occur immediately upon approval? Or in the case of OMP, it was a series of construction projects which had multiple years associated with it. And so, yes, they will take a look at existing versus future for no action and proposed action.
That's it. We're gonna have you grab noise contours this summer.
Yes.
All expectations of how those contours, I think it's big for all the residents.
It would not be appropriate for me to comment. This is the FAA's document and I don't want to speak out of turn. Chairman, I do not want to frustrate the regulatory review. The CDA is in a regulatory review process and the FAA is the lead and I do not want to predetermine any answer or frustrate the timeline.
Historically, every time we've gotten noise contours, well, is that happening at is that always the assumption? Is that expected?
I think we are nearing a point of diminishing returns in that the reason why the noise contour has shrunk over the decades is because the aircraft keep getting quieter, right? And that is still the case, right? Stage 5 was approved in 2017, but there is no congressional mandate to require the airlines to utilize stage 4 or stage 5. Now they're doing it anyway because newer generation aircraft happen to be more fuel efficient and there are trade-offs between fuel burn and noise and emissions. So the aircraft are getting quieter as the airlines retire old aircraft and introduce new aircraft into the fleet. So it is reasonable to assume that generally aircraft continue to get quieter. But remember that when the model is done, it depends on how many flights, in what combination is the aircraft in terms of the fleet, right? Which aircraft are quieter versus louder than others, particularly for the departure profile and the arrival profile. So I would say generally, yes, aircraft are getting quieter, but the runway, here's a good example. As you know, for OMP, the contour not only shrunk, but it really changed shape because of the orientation of the runways. And we have certain lobes of that OMP contour that are long and skinny versus others that are broader and wider because they're representative of departure utilization. And so I think it goes to the issue of the contour may or may not shrink. It is also reasonable that the contour would change shape depending on the runway utilization, especially given daytime versus nighttime, right? The model requires a 10 decibel penalty, which means that every nighttime flight is the equivalent of 10 daytime flights. So depending on which runways are used at night is really going to affect the shape of that noise contour, just as it did with OMP.
So there will be new homes that were not previously in the noise.
That is highly likely.
What are the plans to? insulate this home?
Right now, the CDA would likely continue the residential sound insulation program. That is a program we've been offering since 1995. As you know, we've never stopped. Recession and pandemic, excluded. However, we have full funding authorization for ONP homes. Upon approval of that new noise contour, the CDA would then go back to the airlines and seek new funding approval, right? In order to say, the CDA would likely say, we would like to continue the program with airline support, and we are seeking approval of a new round of funding.
Okay, so that's also the CDA's anticipating coming back with more money.
Yes. And I'm saying that not as a commitment of the department, but as an indication of where we are likely headed.
I think that's good.
Right, until the CDA asks the airlines, right? Again, we've been doing this for 27 years. There's a good chance we would continue it.
I'll respect it. Any other questions for Mr. Frank? Yes.
The FAA in its 65 ENL figuring process says that it's an algorithm rather than physical live measurement.
Correct.
Okay. Are they ever planning on using live sound measurements, real sound measurements in their assessment in the environmental impact statement or anything?
I would say no. When you are looking at, and there are two reasons why I say that, Frank. The first is because when you're looking at something in the future, you can't measure noise that hasn't happened yet. So when they're looking at future conditions, the only way to calculate it is to do a modeling estimate, right? Run that model for the assumptions at the time, let the computer plug and chug, and you're predicting noise levels at the future condition with the proposed project, okay? I think the other reason is the FAA just went through a review that was mandated by Congress in order to validate the 65 DNL. And so that review is done. The agency has determined that the 65 DNL is still the metric of choice. So knowing that it's the metric of choice, but when you have to apply it to a future condition, right, the only way to know that future condition definitively is to model it, which is to say it's not definitive because it's all based on assumptions going into the model, run the model out, come the numbers for each of the modeled points. Does that
I'll
help?
touch on a little bit on that too. 136. We'll touch on it.
Okay, Jeffrey's saying we're gonna come back to that question in another aspect of later in today's meeting.
Thank you.
Any other questions? What's that? What's that? Yeah. All right.
But I guess it
Happens here. for the record.
I want to go back to the draft. So,
Draft EA,
yeah,
which is one notch lower than an EIS.
so listening to all this and as you said, this project has gotten dragged out for whatever reason, nobody's fault. Right? The five was supposed to complete in 2013, and now we're 18, and now we're 23, 24, 25. The frustration with the residents, the community in general, is their inability to get to a point to where we can actually answer the questions everybody wants to answer. What's the end result of all that's happened at the airport? Like, we seem to keep pushing the bar out, creating layers to buffer delivering those answers or what the end results can be. Finally built out and agree how it functions and operates. Well, that was the statement. The question kind of is, I believe that we have all this data. I don't know why we need to push out another 2 to 3 years to come up with the answers I think we could come up with now. I think the argument of we have to look at the data, but we know how we're going to use the airport. We know how it was intended to be used. We know the weather that's existed. This is not a new commodity out there. There's plenty of data to get there. And can you give me some kind of reason why this needs to be extended out? It seems like 5 more years.
Alderman, can you clarify for me? Are you, when you ask that question, are you thinking more about OMP or the future projects with the TAP and the converting the 10 right offset to a permanent condition?
Well, I think they're all part and parcel of the same thing. And we keep creating other little finer nuances of the airport to never complete the original project or intent.
Okay, that helps. So I would say all of us want to finish the OMP. And we all, and the FAA is putting in writing for all of you, the goal is to finish the 9 right navigational aids this year, within the next 7 months, right? They're committing squarely to having it done by next July. But if at all, the construction teams can expedite the project, everybody desires to finish it in 2022. And I think that should give you some hope in terms of we're almost done. Like we really are almost done. All the other runways are done. All that's going on is we're finishing navigational aids for runway 9 right, 27 left. And should we finish that this calendar year, then next year, we're going to start to see what does the airfield look like with 8 runways in that orientation, in their full utilization and capacity.
So within that, right, we played the musical chair or musical runway game of switching with runways because of construction cycling, right? We have to switch runways. We took those out of cycle from what the original plan was to build out, in the original 2005 OMP. That's kind of my concern, is that we keep going back and forth and creating this. It's almost like we're never going to get to the final build out and the final question of how are the other runways being used. And are we going to heavily rely on the right ones, which impact certain communities more than other communities, right? So you spoke to or said, when we get there, we're going to see how all the runways work. Well, we kind of already have an understanding of what we're going to do. All the questions I've ever asked indicate that we're not going to operate too much different than we are operating today, other than the intermissions of finalizing the airports or finalizing the last runways. I don't know if you understood what I was saying, but
I think so. But again, I would just say we all desire to finish it this year. And this draft EA that you see this summer is going to be a snapshot into the FAA's thinking as to what's going on with existing conditions versus what's going to go on with future conditions.
thank you.
Once the tax is complete, will there be another evaluation of the first method, or will it simply be writing out the quiet time for it?
Generally in the airport world, there's 2 primary reasons why noise contours are prepared. In the case of O'Hare, it's been as a result of development program, right? The airport is changing. We added runways. The runways change the air traffic changes the noise impacts. At Midway, we don't have that, right? So Midway, the noise contour is the product of a different FAA regulatory program, and noise contours there are updated simply for the sake of refreshing it and making sure that the noise contour reflects current conditions. There will be a time at O'Hare where the noise contour is less about airport development and more about sort of routine operation of the airport. So I think the TAP is forecasted to be about a 10-year program. So we're talking at least 8 to 10 years from now before we reach that point. Generally, though, noise contours have a useful life. And so the record of decision said, this is the noise contour we're using until this program is done. And so what we'll do is when the TAP is approved, we'll look at that decision document. When Fly Quiet is approved, we'll look at that decision document in order to understand, how this noise contour will be used and for generally what period of time.
Just have a technical question, if you don't mind. The summer 2022 because it will affect people's acceptance of the contours and realizing what's happened over the last 2 years. What is the baseline activity level being used? Every state, is it 2019? Is it 2020?
That's an excellent question. So that will be very clear in the document when the FAA releases it
Do
this
we know
summer.
what that year is?
I do, but it is not appropriate for me to talk about that right now. Yes,
Because obviously that will affect people's acceptance, because obviously activity in 2019 is very different,
correct,
or 2021.
correct.
Good morning, Aaron.
Good morning.
I know that this is not to put you on the spot.
It's okay. I'm already on the spot.
I know, no, I was trying to soften the spot. I don't expect you to answer for the FAA, but for example, you mentioned, that, and we know that an EIS is more stringent than an EA through the environmental process, correct?
It's more detailed.
Okay, more detail, thank you. We did an EIS for IF2, right?
No, we did. So that's a third option. So that's a good question. So for interim flight quiet, we did a reevaluation of the EIS, which, so there's an EIS, there's an EA, and there's a reevaluation document, which is a third option.
Okay, wait. My question then goes for the TAP ATA. In your experience, if this wasn't O'Hare, it was some other airport or something that was going on similar to this, would that be the level that the review would go to, would be an EA instead of an EIS?
Probably yes. So the FAA has clear rules as to when an EIS is needed. One of those is when you do a major runway extension. One of those is when you build a new runway. One of those is when you build a new airport. So if you do not have those three, you're not automatically in EIS land, right? So it's much more common to do environmental assessments across the country. And we did that a few years ago at Midway when we were incorporating flight changes. EAs are generally more common. EISs are rare, and they have a certain complexity based on the complexity of the project. And so if we're not building new runways, if we're not doing runway extensions, it is not automatic that we would do an EIS. So I think generally the federal government is trying to right size the document with the level of complexity.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
Any other questions? So isn't part of the 2005 EIS that we perform an EIS at the end of build out?
Correct, that was a requirement in the FAA.
Is at the end of putting the well, they have to that three for the runways.
Yeah.
Isn't that that would be the completion of the runways on the airport?
Correct. And Alderman, what the FAA is saying is we're not going to do that anymore. That was the requirement. But because the CDA has a new development program for terminal redevelopment, it doesn't make sense to have two noise contours at the same time, right?
So, if I may, so who made that decision? And
The FAA.
why do they get to make that decision?
The FAA made the decision because they're the federal regulator. They decide what level of NEPA review is required, and they decide how to approve that document. So the reason why we're not doing OMP build out +5 is number one, the OMP assumptions are quite old. They're already 17 years old. So if we did that exercise, it likely would not have significant meaning to all of you because it's based on assumptions that are so old that it's no longer helpful. So with this TAP EA, everybody is taking a fresh look at the airport and the airfield as it is today and re-baselining that in order to have the most current assumptions in terms of noise. And the FAA does not want to have two noise contours on the books at the same time.
I get that they don't want that. And I get that you're going to continue doing other stuff at the airport, and so there's a reason not to do. EV, EA. And you're saying that the data from the 2005 EIS is really useless today? So far removed from where we are today?
Right, I'm not saying it's useless, I'm saying it's very outdated, right?
But isn't part of the reason that we're doing that is for the comparative? So I understand that the data or the assumptions, 2005, we might look at that today and go, well, they're kind of outdated, that's not where we want it to be. But I'm looking at it, and, not being the smartest guy in the room, going, wasn't that the intent? To go, this is where we started, this is where we wound up. And it's our job to look at that data and go, what assumptions did we make there, and how did we get here? And these are really the new assumptions that then explain how we got from point A to point B, as opposed to, as I stated before, now we're going to an interim EV to extend it out 5 more years. We're going to do terminals and other new things, and we don't want pre-studies. And it seems like we never get to the answer. We never get to the end. We continue to add an extension to the game, and we keep playing. It's like we're never going to know who won or lost. Not that this is a winner, but just where we're at. That's part of my frustration.
Okay. I would say that we have all wanted to finish the ONP sooner. We're on track to finish it this year. One of the key things about the noise contour is to ensure that the noise contour is current and relevant, right? So it doesn't make sense anymore to run an ONP build out +5 noise contour, run that model on assumptions that are 17 years old. So what the FAA is saying is, forget that. The new noise contour will have newer assumptions, current assumptions, and will be a better indicator of noise in the present and the future. And so
the state the obvious question I think we were asking is, at what point do we stop estimating that actual use baseline data?
never, that's not the way it works. Noise contours, when they are approved, are based on the future condition. So that is contingent for sound insulation funding. If you want to get federal funding, you must be sound insulating to a future condition. And so the FAA, in order to standardize noise contours across the country, they do not rely on the Tampa noise monitors and the O'Hare noise monitors and the Seattle noise monitors. Because number one, people could have different make and model equipment. They could have different modeling assumptions, and they could have different runway conditions that are unique to that airport. So the way the FAA standardizes this is says, everybody's going to use the same model, and everybody's going to look at a future condition. And so that's how they run the regulatory program nationwide, in order to require some standardization of protocols for all airports across the country. Now, that being said, typically when noise contours are done, and we did this in the EIS, and this is not a secret, you run 2 noise contours at a minimum. You run the existing conditions so that people have an understanding of what's happening in the present, and then you run the future conditions, right? That will be the case for TAP as well. But the existing conditions noise contour is not the basis for sound insulation. The basis for sound insulation is the future conditions noise contour, or the build-out noise contour, if that helps. But Chairman, to answer your question, the FAA is not going to authorize noise contours based on existing conditions as a basis for sound insulation. They want all airports to be working towards improving the future situation.
We find out that 9 right becomes the favorite runway for air traffic controllers, so when planes on, they don't.
Okay.
That's the actual. Big topic.
Aaron, a couple of things.
Does the FAA prohibit the CDA from providing sound insulation on their own?
No,
Okay.
before the EIS, the city did it voluntarily from 1995 to 2005. We did it for 10 years as a voluntary program.
Okay,
We were
then-
doing that in the spirit of outwill and community involvement. We did it voluntarily. We asked the airlines for money. We knew that we had a noise program and the CDA did it voluntarily. With the approval of the EIS, it then became mandatory. And because the FAA said, yes, you can modernize O'Hare and you will offer sound insulation to those people who are significantly affected by noise. And so there was a trade-off. Yes, you can modernize it, but now RSIP, you have to offer it to those who want it.
Okay, so there's several issues there. There's people who live 4 houses away from the end of a block where the contour ends. They're experiencing every bit the same amount of noise as the people living in the contour, and yet we're powerless, or we can't do anything to help them. In the spirit of being a good neighbor, could CDA and O'Hare continue that voluntary program of assisting people who have shown a real need for noise remediation?
We can to finish the block. For 20 years, the FAA has allowed us to do block grounding and finish the block. But there's the limit, right? The rule is beyond the block grounded block, the answer is no. Those folks, the model would show are point whatever DNL less than, right? So you've got the 65 DNL. The people at the end of the block are probably 64.9 or 64.8 in terms of model value. That's where the FAA draws the line. They will allow us to voluntarily finish the block, but beyond that, on the next block, they would say, no, that's not consistent, and therefore that's not allowable.
It doesn't quite make sense. If it's voluntary, you should be allowed to do it.
Something where we're.
Right, but Frank, I can clarify it in that, right? It goes to the issue of how you utilize airport dollars, right? So even though it's voluntary, I still have to get permission to do it.
Okay, one other quick thing. Early on in your presentation, you said the fly quiet, there's a 10% penalty or a 10% factor added to the noise. Okay, each 747 produces the equivalent noise from what I've read and it's been presented here. Each 747 or similar aircraft produces about 400 times the noise that a non-wide body makes.
Okay.
A non-wide body aircraft makes. How does that, we're adding 10%, but most of the nighttime cargo carriers are fully loaded and taking off low and slow. And they're producing 400 times the amount of noise, but it's only counting for 10%.
So let's clarify. The difference is 10 decibels, which is on a logarithmic scale.
I understand.
So you're exactly right in that if there's a nighttime 747, it's going to magnify that by 10 decibels in the noise contour algorithm.
And that's huge. Explain to the audience what 10 decibels is.
Jeffrey, go ahead.
I mean, I think there's 2 things here, right? There's each individual aircraft, that how it's factored, all those things you mentioned, that's factored in, the runway use, how heavy they are, all those things are factored in. And then there's also this nighttime penalty. So this nighttime penalty, think of it as every operation at night, think of it as multiplied times 10. That's the way you should think of it.
Is it multiplied by 10 or 10%?
Not 10%, not 10%. It's multiplied by a factor of 10.
Remember,
factor of
10%,
10.
Frank, when you're thinking of that, you're thinking of a linear 10%, not a
I understand.
logarithmic.
I heard the number 10 and I thought I heard
We-
it as a 10%.
Yeah, we have a couple slides on this in our Noise 101. I know that's not on the agenda today, but we can get that tomorrow and get that back out.
I understand it totally.
Okay.
It was my misunderstanding of what was said.
So Frank, to go back to your question, right? Your point is good in that a 747 at night is very different than a CRJ, a Canadair regional jet. So the noise model would account for that, right? Whatever that aircraft is anticipated to fly at nighttime, the model would take into account and add that 10 decibel penalty, even if that aircraft is already louder in the first place. So your point is well taken, and the model is going to account for that.
Discussion. One last one, Aaron.
One last question.
I guess
Has nothing to do with TAP or ATA, but it does have to do with runway utilization. I've noted that we're moving closer and closer in east flow days, nights, whatever, of moving departures back off of 9 center back to their traditional departure runway, which is 9 right. Do we anticipate that's going to continue? 'Cause I know
Yes.
we're still seeing 9 center departures.
It's gonna continue, but it's gonna be sporadic too. Some days they're there, other days they're off and the runway's closed for some maintenance inspections and FAA work. So it's gonna be sporadic. That's maybe why you see it one day that, oh, hey, maybe things are happening that way. And then the next week, something might be closed. So just be aware of it.
I understand the reasons for it. Are one of those reasons, all the departures have nothing to do with the ILS? Does that have to do with the TAP 2-3 work that's going on? Is that part of it?
That's one of the reasons. too.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
All right, that concludes the discussion of item 4C. 4B, we'll move on to 4C. Fly through this one.
Yep, understand.
For their 2022 flag fly.
As I bring it up here. One thought is you guys are asking all the right questions. I think the challenge is, we have a regulator that has a process for all these things on the forecast and the model and how to do NEPA and how to do FAA assumptions. And I think those are a lot of processes. And the goal is to make sure they're done the same way in Chicago as they're done across the country. And so maybe once there's a fly quiet, submittal and recommendation from this group, maybe there's a opportunity to talk about some of those processes in detail, a NEPA process or whatever, we can bring that to the committee if appropriate. Because there are a lot of topics that we're trying to cover in a letter, and so I think
There's a technical committee and sometimes they're shut down.
Yeah.
Questions, but they're-
but they were good questions. They're really good questions. I would encourage some of those questions, opportunity even ask the FAA whenever they have their workshop. And some of those we will also cover on item E, which I know is a big topic too. So I will try to get to that as quickly as possible. So this is the Fly Quiet report. All this stuff's in your packets. These things will also be on the website, so you have access to it. This is for first quarter 2022. We have a background. I'll try to go a little bit quicker here since we're running on time. One thing I like about the very first page is at the bottom. This tracks our fly quiet mode. When we start, when we exit. The very end of the report, we have a table with the exact days and times, which is important. So this is kind of depending on what kind of brain person you are. If you really like that table, we have that in the back for every day. If you really like seeing it on a graphic, we have a graphic. So we can have it 2 different ways. Same information both ways. The graphic, you can see the top of the line pointing down, the little triangle pointing down. That's when we went into fly quiet. Every day throughout the quarter. On the bottom pointing up, that's when we got out of fly quiet. So that's what we call our fly quiet mode. You'll see the arrows pointing down. That's when we went in. You can see they're spread. Obviously, they're concentrated more in the 10, 11 o'clock hour, but you can see some are spread all the way up to almost 3 o'clock. I think that was one day. And when you can see we came out of fly quiet, for the most part, other than 2 occurrences, they're fairly consistent around that 6 to 7 o'clock hour. When we look at the entire quarter, we were in flight quiet on average throughout that quarter, 7 hours and 6 minutes. That averaged out to about 97 operations during flight quiet. So that's what the average was. So we have more details on page 2, some summaries. Again, I'm gonna try to go through a little bit since we went fast, since we're running out of time. Our calculations for our deviation, which we'll get to in a minute, 84% are less than half a mile, which is great. 13% within half a mile and a mile, and only 3% greater than a mile. And we'll show that on a chart and go in detail for it in a few minutes. Here are operations by hour. The top are arrivals, the bottom are departures. I think the big thing here is you see deep in the middle of the night, right? 1:12, 1, 2, 3 a.m. We do not have many operations. When we don't have much activity, we expect these aircraft to fly on the designated runway and to fly on the preferential flight path. So we expect good adherence during that time. We know as you get closer to the beginning and into flight quiet, there's a greater chance of deviation, but because we see those low numbers there, we know we have fewer operations. We know they should be able to fly on the runway and the path that we want. and you'll see these same metrics come up, 7 hours and 6 minutes, 97 operations. We have at the bottom, if you're interested in the entire night, 9 hours throughout the night, we had 178 operations. That encompassed both fly quiet and not fly quiet, all nighttime. That nighttime is important because as we were talking about earlier, that's the penalty, that's the weighted penalty for DNL is that nighttime factor. So that's why we track it that way, 10 to 7. It's the FAA's kind of definition of night, 10 to 7. Runway use, this is for just nighttime, those 9 hours, not fly quiet. You can see the biggest concentration here, 10 left, 28 right. They have by far the vast majority of operations, 53% of the departures on 28 right, 17 on the same piece of pavement going east. That makes up a huge percent. And then we look at arrivals, you're seeing them on 10 center, 28 center. For 20% on 10 center, 53% on 28 center. If you look at the North Airfield, you're seeing no arrivals on 9 right, 27 left, which is not a surprise due to the work, and only 3 and 2% departures on 9 right, 27 left. When we go to fly quiet, this is just that fly quiet mode. Every time when they were in fly quiet, we've highlighted the purple arrows. You still see a large portion of the departures are on 10 left, 28 right, 45% and 14%. If you look at the arrivals, 57% on 28 center, 23% on 10 center, that comes out to 80% of the operation or arrivals on that runway, which is not a fly quiet runway. You notice it's not purple. When you look up to the North Airfield, where we wanted them on 9 right, 27 left, you see zeros. As we talked about, as that runway nears its completion, we are not utilizing it for arrivals at this time. That is what we're hoping to change, right? So that is something that you note. Those operations, especially arrivals, are on the runway that's not even designated an arrival runway during flight quiet. Also note, not as a surprise, our 2 crosswind runways see zeros on them. Zeros for departures, zeros for arrival. We know this is something you guys are working to try to change with the flight quiet 21, but as you see existing conditions, we do not utilize those at the night during flight quiet. I won't go through all this, but we have the largest 2 arrival runways. We've broken out by carrier. We have all the carriers listed out for 10 center and 28 center. We have the carrier listed. We have a designator, whether it's cargo or passenger, that's that C or P under type. And then we have how many operations or arrivals in this case they have during the quarter. At one point, you guys were really interested in who's arriving and coming into the airport. This gives you a long list, and it's even broken out the cargo and passenger. Both 10 center and 28 center. And then we've done something similar for departures, but we've added in the deviation for the preferential flight path. We've done it for both 10 left and 28 right, the 2 most used departure runways. Again, the carrier, the type, whether it's passenger or cargo, and then we have the number of departures along with the deviation. You will notice when we look at this deviation, I think I only saw 1 on 10 left, which was Airbridge Cargo Airlines. I think it had 1 and it deviated quite a bit. I think that was the only red I saw. And then most of the orange I saw on both pages were very narrowly missed the green. I think I saw a 0.55, a 0.57, a 0.59, a 0.52. So you see some numbers that are very close, and those just gone into green. You've had even more in green. And that kind of leads me to our picture. Again, it's kind of like the fly quiet, depends on what type of person you are. Do you like it in the table? Do you like it in the graphic? We have a graphic here with a summary table below. When you look at this graphic, when I look at it, I see a ton of green on the preferential flight path. It is not distributed on every runway. We know the current flight quiet program isn't doing that, but you can see a very concentrated effort to fly these preferential flight paths. And we had over 80% on green and a very large portion on green, only 3% red. We had a couple of anomalies. We did have 1 departure, I believe, the whole quarter on 4 right, and it was a red. So you see 100% on 4 right, but it was only 1 aircraft. But you're seeing very big numbers on green. We've talked about it before, but you don't have to go back many years where this was very distributed and spread out. They weren't on the flight paths. This goes to both the ONCC and CDA outreaching to FAA, working with FAA. Clearly, the folks in the tower, they're trying to get them on this preferential flight path. And in most cases, the vast majority of the cases, it's working. In all, we had 3,175 tracks during flight quiet. We're also tracking the ones that aren't fly quiet. They're kind of the light blue, if you will. They're really faded on the screen and on the map. But they're there just very lightly. We're really shading the green, red, and orange during flight quiet. These are our 40 noise monitors. You know where they're at. This is our noise monitor table. Couple of notes here. We're talking about LEQ now. So typically when you look at a monthly report, you're looking at DNL. That's that 24-hour time weighted nighttime penalty that Aaron talked about. Since we don't have 24 hours and we're just dealing with night here, that is not that metric. So this is LEQ, which is just taking the straight logarithmic average at night. There's no penalty or anything like that. So if you take this chart and you try to compare it to the monthly chart, those are two different metrics. So you don't want to do that. This is just LEQ. It's just averaging the nighttime noise. When I look at this in general, because I have a couple notes here, I'm seeing a lot of numbers that are red in the first quarter. It's comparing it to the same quarter previous year when we didn't have many operations. So we have more operations. But the other thing I note when I look at it, I'm seeing a lot of fairly low numbers with a couple exceptions. I'm seeing a lot of low numbers. I'm seeing a lot of 40s. I'm seeing a few 30 decibels. That's very quiet at night, which we expect. So those are generally very good. Now, a couple that I wanted to note, I think site 30 in Wooddale. Notice that one at 38. That one used to be a lot louder. That's the one to the south there. We used to have a lot of flights off 28 right turning south, and that monitor used to have a higher value. So that's an indication of, hey, these preferential flight paths are working. That monitor's really gone down over time. It's now at 38. So that one was noted. And then we had a few noise monitors that I thought were a little high. No surprise. If you take a look at the map, site 31 just off the end of 28 right and site 28 off the other end on 10 left. Those are two monitors that seem fairly high. So 28, we had 64. That's one of the monitors. I think there was only two monitors that hit 60 plus right off the end of that runway that was high. That runway had a lot of use in it. That monitor is also probably hearing some noise from 10 center, 28 center. So that monitor was high. And then down at 31 in Bensonville, it was 62.8. I think they were, let's go back and check. I think there were only two monitors over 60. And few, we had some 50, but again, a lot of 40s and 30s. So those two monitors were high again, probably to the overuse there in the south airfield. And then complaints. We've gone over this at monthly meeting. It's the same information except boiled down just to night. So households for January, February, March are broken out. We also have total in the column to the right. When you look at it, I don't see many big numbers here on households. I noticed Chicago has some, right? 40, 48, and 54. But after that, I think the next community was Park Ridge, 19, 19, and 26. Those numbers don't seem overwhelmingly number of large households. And then after that, I couldn't even find the highest number. It might have been Schiller Park at 8, 15, and 9, something like that. And so we had a lot of low numbers after that. So that tells me at night, the complaints we're getting, the vast majority are really coming from Chicago and Park Ridge from households. And there's a small number everywhere else. Ground run-up enclosure, great number here, 92%. We have all the airlines broken out. This number seems to have gone up in recent times. I'm not quite sure why. I know we've done some outreach, but I don't know that it's necessarily attributed to that. But we've seen a greater utilization. When I look about aircraft type, only thing that really sticks out at me is the 757. That is an aircraft that lately has consistently been only 33%. It can power in and do a turn, unless that's a newer model 757 that I'm not aware of. So that's something we probably need to check on. The others that don't have good usage are the wide bodies, the ones that need extra staff. It needs a tug to push it back. They typically need at least 2 additional people on either side watching wingtip clearance for the ground run enclosure. That extra staff, that's what we've seen lately, the why they haven't been using it. Except for the 757, we need to check on it. It could be that that's a newer modified model that for some reason can't do a power in by itself. But those are kind of notes on GRE. Good numbers overall. We can follow up on the 757. And then here's our table of fly quiet in the report. Same information as the beginning on the first page with the triangles, just in table form. I know some of you were like, oh my gosh, this seems like a lot of information. But this is something we track every day. Our staff's tracking every day. It's important that we track this every day and have the numbers of what specific time we went in fly quiet and came out, because everything else in the report is kind of predicated on that. If we book in and tag everything that's fly quiet, that allows us to run runway use. That allows us to run these metrics and determine what happened in that given period of time. It also allows you, if you ever note or have a concern from a resident, why is it this day or that day? Did we not go into flag quiet or not? Or it seemed like we started late? You can jot that number down. Most of us with smartphones now, I mean, Siri or whatever can record our voice, make a note of it, of what day it is, because you ultimately have these that you can come back to and say, why on, this date, and you can get the time that we specifically went into flag quiet or came out if there was an issue, and then we can follow up with you if need be. So these are important. And like always, we have all this information on the website. So that was my version of a quick expedited flag quiet. And tailoring it, I think the next topic's the same, general topic was the flag quiet recognition program. Couple.
Any questions on the flag quiet report?
So regarding the noise monitor in ROI. So the noise monitor is currently located about 3 blocks north of Lawrence Avenue. Recently I moved. Previous to that, I was south of Lawrence Avenue, like about 5 or 6 homes south of Lawrence Avenue. You could not have a conversation in any of the backyards in that area. My new home is about a half a block from the noise monitor. Night and day difference, peace and quiet. You don't hear a thing. Can we make an adjustment to that monitor? Can we put something south of Lawrence Avenue where we're actually having it?
So a couple things. So a noise monitor, when we put it in place, we're doing a couple things with it. One of the things we're primarily doing is trying to track things over time, even if it goes up or down. So the goal isn't necessarily to get it the loudest, it's more to track what happens over time. So we like keeping monitors in place the best we can. We sometimes have utility issues, we have to move them, but if we can, we like putting a monitor in and keeping it there. Because then we're able to quantify for you if it went up or down, either seasonally throughout the year or even over long periods of time. We can come back and say at this location, this is how much it's increased or decreased, and we can quantify that for you. Noise monitors in other locations, even in the same community, but further away that have a different noise. We can either do a portable noise monitor, which we have available, put in a portable noise monitor, or is what the city has done over time, as you can see, put in a lot of permanents. I'm not saying we can put in a permanent one. That's something the CDA and ONCC would have to talk about, but in most of these others that have been put forward, the ONCC, the tech committee has recommended, the CDA has indicated they're willing to put in new monitors. As we're doing now, we've just installed some new monitors here recently that the CDA has brought updates to this tech committee. So those are kind of the two options. One is potentially even a portable noise monitor, put it out there, deploy it at your house or somebody else's house, put that report on the network or on the internet to show everybody what that noise is over a short period of time in that neighborhood.
Yeah, because it looks like most of the traffic for us is over Lawrence Avenue.
Usually when we're sighting the monitors, we try to put it in the path. Sometimes it's not directly in the path, but we do try to put it in the path. So it's common that it's in communities over higher traffic areas.
We can look into a portable monitor.
Yeah, it's available to everybody. There's a form on the website. We can get you that information and sign up for it.
Can you get that information over? Our portable noise monitors are collecting dust. I know the guy wants to get them out in the field, so please.
We just posted on social media.
Just post on social media. Check out our Thank you. Anything else on the Black White reports? Segueing right into the awards.
Yeah, on the awards, so a couple updates. One update is CDA will be presenting to the airlines about this update in the near future. We have an internal airline meeting that's regularly scheduled with airlines and FAA. We're going to be presenting what you've done here and the 2021 stats to that group of airlines internally in the near future. And then the next meeting of this committee, we are planning on looking at for bringing to you the first quarter of 2022, or first quarter, first half, whatever it is, of 2022 to the committee. So those are the two updates I have for you.
Any questions on the awards?
To my knowledge, the airlines haven't necessarily been formally briefed. So this briefing internally to the airlines will be the first time they're briefed.
I was hoping that's fine. let's brief them sooner rather than later, so they're starting aware that it's super weird if we start canning out of the boards.
Right, so we've had normally pre-COVID regular meetings with them. During COVID, those meetings got extended and over Zoom. They're back to in-person meetings, so we think we can make that happen in person, which would be appropriate.
In the interest of time, we do have an item, airport noise capacity act review. It is not mission critical, it is not, it is simply topical. Anyone opposed to cabling or anyone opposed to cabling this, pick it up at our next meeting. Really want to talk to this today. All right, I want to be respectful of everyone's time, there's a lot of that up here, so we'll make a motion to table that.
So moves.
Second, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? All right, that is.
I was gonna say
You
Ernie.
stole
Ernie
all
and
my things.
Kunkel.
I just do that. The ad hoc daytime noise insight committees subcommittee report. Ernie?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. The ad hoc daytime noise subcommittee met on Thursday, May 12th, 2022 at 9 o'clock in the morning in Highway with all but your chair at Park Ridge City Hall. The meeting was almost completely a presentation by the FAA going into tremendous detail of daytime air traffic management at O'Hare International Airport. Mr. Ian Gebhardt, Air Traffic Manager at FAA Chicago District, offered the subcommittee insight into the complexities of the operation and how changes, especially flow turnarounds, ripple through the entire national airspace system. Significant discussion focused on how winds and other meteorological conditions have impact. Chair would like to publicly thank the FAA and Mr. Gebhardt for their effort. In addition, Mr. Ryan Anderson of Lander and Brown reviewed the work plan the subcommittee has been following, which started with airport operations. The subcommittee is now in a better place to wrap up this first phase of the work plan at its next meeting on Thursday, June 16, 2022 at 9 a.m. at Park Ridge City Hall. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my report.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate the Ernie report. All right, the next OC Technical Committee meeting will be held here on September 13th. So we got a few months off here at Betsville Village Hall. So that's prices down by that. Do we have any comments from the ONCC members?
One quick one, I just want to report to those who don't know Maryland May. Yes, very close one. Certainly a little people. And also over the weekend, I graduated and got my master's degree.
Congratulations.
Grew up with
All right, any comments from the audience? Dan Dwyer, is a comment? Stop sitting close to the podium. I feel like it's just lost. I need to know this is a comment. I'm gonna do that every time.
A lot of good topics today. I don't know quite where to start. You scrubbed ANCA. I was all ready for that one as well. Just talking about superseding noise contours. My understanding is the ONP+5 was to, lack of a better term, mop up any houses that may have been missed and taking into account current conditions. So I don't quite understand this change, other than they don't want to do 3 superseding noise contours in a short period of time. But setting that aside and assuming that TAPEA, well, not assuming, it is the superseding noise contour. The concern I have is, we know the noise contour is largely based on nighttime noise. The TAPEA is going to take into account nighttime noise program that's going to be replaced. And so if those are the homes that are going to be determined for eligibility, where does that leave those that may be affected by the Fly Quiet program? Is there going to be another funded round of sound installation? I think there's a big question there for the ONCC to make sure that when this is complete, that everyone within the contour should be eligible. I guess they're eligible if they're in the contour, but if there's actually going to be funding, I don't see the airlines wanting to just hand out money every time we say, here's the next noise contour. there is a distinction that the TAPDA is requested by CDA and FAA, whereas a permanent flight by is requested by the ONCC. Hopefully there'll be a, if not a deeper dive, that fly by it, at least before that plan's approved. Make sure that that's going to happen. I think that's where there's a real risk of fly by before seeing that FAA. I do think there's a lot of information in that conversation that potentially affects flight. That's all. Thank you.
If I were to have residents who were input contour but ineligible for any other council comments? See none. Do I
I
have-
move with,
do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor, indicate saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay.
Woods.
Thanks for your
Janice,
comments.
and I'm going to say,
Woods, say
Malcolm.
Woods.
It's fine.
Is this your pen?
This is the first one.
No,
Capitals.
no, it was here.
I'm gonna keep it.
It might have sucked.
And why is it there?
And I think that's a new pen. I don't need to more.
Uh-huh.
Contest ended.
One second, sorry.
10:15.
congratulations.